Well, thank you everyone for joining on this Wednesday night. I really appreciate everybody who submitted questions, and I'll try to get through all of them the best I can. But I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, and we'll kind of go over what the flow of today's presentation will look like. And hopefully at the end, we'll have plenty of time for some questions as well. So I'm going to get this up and running. Hopefully I do it right. Sometimes I'm challenged here. All right, can everyone see the presentation?
Yeah.
All right, cool. Okay, so I won't be able to see if there's questions that come through, so Daniel's gonna help me out. But I'm gonna start with kind of the title of the presentation is what happens in the gut.
Ariana,
Yeah.
I think it cut your screen. Yeah,
Oh,
there we go.
what about now? Is that better?
Yep, that's live.
Okay, what about now? Okay. Can you see my big screen or the presenter view?
We're seeing the entire kind of web page.
Okay, perfect. So like I was saying, the title of today's presentation is what happens in the gut doesn't always stay in the gut. And hopefully by the end of today, you'll kind of learn why I titled it that. But I want to talk about what we know about the gut, how the gut microbiome affects our health, and also where the research is headed. And so I'll just say that like in an hour, that is not enough time to go through all of the research that we have on the gut microbiome. We'd probably be here for days. So hopefully we'll get through the high points and the things that you guys are most interested in based on your questions, and follow up on the rest of it hopefully in the future. So my name is Ariana. I am currently a health coach with Wild Health. But I wanted to first kind of go through an outline of what you guys can expect today. So here we go. I'm sorry, guys. So we are going to talk a little bit about the anatomy of the digestive tract, what the microbiome is, some diseases and conditions associated with impaired gut health, factors that affect the gut microbiome, how to positively impact gut health, where the research is headed, and any questions at the end. So first of all, how did I get into studying and caring about gut health? So I have a long history of what people might think of as a sensitive stomach. How many of you have been diagnosed with IBS? You know, that's kind of the blanket term, but a lot of times there's a lot more to it. And so throughout my life, I did a lot of research just for my own reasons. And that kind of led me into wanting to study nutrition through college. After college, I joined the team at the Center for Functional Medicine, where I did a lot of research on pre and probiotics. And then I went back for my graduate degree studying female performance and how the gut microbiome affects female athletes. So there's a lot of different avenues to gut health, as you'll see in this presentation, but I want to start by going through a few true false questions just to get right into it. So if you could just kind of answer this on your own, and then I'll show the answer in just a minute. But the first question is true or false. The digestive tract refers to the stomach, small intestine, colon, or small intestine and colon, or large intestine. Give you guys a second to think about it. That is false. So the digestive tract also refers to the mouth, the esophagus, all the way down through a rectum. So from the time you make a decision to eat something, from the time that you go to the bathroom, that whole process is considered your digestive tract. And digestion actually begins in the mouth with the digestion of carbohydrates. The next question is the term microbiome was originally described by Dr. Joshua Lederberg as an ecological system of commensal, symbiotic, and perhaps pathogenic microorganisms that reside in the body. And that one is true. That's Dr. Joshua Lederberg in his lab. And here is a picture of him when he won the Nobel Prize in Physiology of Medicine in 1958. And he was really awarded this for his discoveries concerning the genetic recombination and the organization of the genetic material all the way back in 1951. So the research on the gut microbiome is not something that is new knowledge, but there's been a lot of updates and it's evolved a lot. And we still have so much to learn, even after all of those years of studying the microbiome. True or false, identical twins share the same DNA. This means that they also share the same microbiome. This is false because each one of our microbiomes are as unique as our fingerprints. So while living in the same household, living in even the same neighborhood, similar environments, some of us might have similar microbiomes, but each one of us, just due to our lifestyle, due to history of playing in the dirt, having pets, antibiotic usage, the type of birth, all of that really has an impact on how our microbiome is developed over time. True or false, humans have more than one microbiome. This is true. We also have an oral, a gut, a vaginal, and skin microbiome. Today, we're going to primarily talk about the gut microbiome, but there are other areas where microbes populate. So a couple of other fun facts to kick us off here. We have about 5 pounds of microbes living on our epithelial surfaces, our fungi, bacteria, and viruses. We have as many bacteria as cells in our body, which is quite a lot. 90% of our cells are actually in the microbiome. Bacterial DNA outnumbers human DNA to 150 to 1. And 3.3 million genes are in the human microbiome. With 10,000 known species of commensal bacteria, and each one of us has between 200 and 1,000, but it definitely differs based on the person, like we'll talk about later in this presentation. So we kind of went through the anatomy of the digestive tract already, but as you can see, starting in the mouth all the way down through our stomach, our small intestine, our large intestine, and the colon. And we also have a couple of accessory organs like our liver, our gallbladder, our pancreas, all of which are really important in helping us digest our foods. So what is gut health and what is the gut microbiome? So gut health is defined as the absence of gastrointestinal symptoms such as abdominal pain, diarrhea, and disease such as inflammatory bowel disease or colon cancer, as well as an absence of other unfavorable local conditions, including increased intestinal permeability, mucosal inflammation, or deficiency, or even excess of short-chain fatty acids. I know that was a mouthful, but I promise we'll talk more about how we can support gut health later. The microbiome refers to the collective genomes of the microbes living in and on the body. And microbes are organisms that are too small to be seen without using a microscope. So those are things like bacteria, viruses, archaea, and single-cell eukaryotes, like amoebas or parameciums that have a nucleus. So the gut microflora is responsible for 3 major things. One is colonization and resistance to pathogens. So this happens in a couple of different ways. Number one, the healthy bacteria kind of prevents the ability for pathogens to accumulate there. And they also take nutrients away from potential pathogenic bacteria. The gut microflora is also responsible for modulation of the gastrointestinal and systemic immune responses. So this is really important because when we think about the digestive tract, we have a single layer of cells. And underneath that is where about 70% of our immune system lies. And if you've ever heard of the gut-associated lymphoid tissue, or GALT, that's what I'm referring to. If you've never heard of that, don't worry about it. But GALT is kind of a general term to describe a lot of those immune system, those things like lymphoid tissues, Peyer's patches, and a lot of our other immune system cells. And then the third way that the gut microflora kind of operates and helps us out is for nutritional support. And this is by supplying essential nutrients and synthesis of things like vitamin K or B vitamins, which you'll learn later is what we call postbiotics. So again, what happens in the gut doesn't always stay in the gut. So right here, you see a picture of the cells of our digestive tract. Here we see undigested foods, antigens, bacteria, and the little hair-like structures there are called microvilli. And what the microvilli do are they help us to absorb different ions, and it kind of helps to facilitate the passage of those things without allowing toxins and antigens to get through those cells. So right here, we see tight junctions, and those are proteins that help those to stay really tight and really promote barrier integrity and prevent those things from getting into our bloodstream, causing an immune response. The cell next to it, you see we actually have a breakdown of those proteins, and they're allowing a lot of food particles, antigens, toxins to actually get through the cells. And you can see it's getting into the bloodstream, which is going to cause a lot of those immune cells to activate, causing a lot of inflammation and a lot of other problems, as we'll talk about today when we look into disease process. So here is a really nice picture I took from a study, and this is kind of describing several factors that influence the density, diversity, and activity of gut bacteria. So in the middle here, you really see how our gut can either promote health and really promote homeostasis, or promote disease through dysbiosis, which really refers to imbalance of our gut bacteria. And on the left-hand side, you'll see that there's lots of external influences, including our diet, medications or antibiotic uses, illness, lifestyle, where we live, and what we're exposed to in our environment. And there's a lot of things also that affect our gut microbiome, including our age, our genetics, stress, surgeries, anatomical structures, and things like that. So taking all of that into account, I kind of wanted to talk about kind of some of those external influences that might not be so great. And then I promise we'll get into kind of the positives soon. But in terms of diet, there's a lot of food additives and a lot of things in our food system now that aren't favorable to good gut health. So we see a lot of preservatives and a lot of food additives in processed foods, particularly things like emulsifiers. And if you know anything about emulsifiers, they're really there to promote shelf life and to promote or to prevent breakdown of foods over time so that we can store them longer. And what emulsifiers do, you may have heard of like soy lecithin or carrageenan before, and those are considered safe for our health. However, we don't really have enough research to show what they do long term. And so what dietary emulsifiers do is they actually attack the bacterial cell walls, kind of at the cell membrane. And this can really affect the types of bacteria that can survive, and also can promote growth of certain bacteria that are actually resistant to some of those things, which are usually less desirable, more pathogenic bacteria. And it also can affect short chain fatty acid production, which short chain fatty acids are the fuel that feeds our good bacteria. So we really need those, because just like us, if we're not having a good diet and we're not eating, we're going to wither away. And the same goes for those good bacteria living in our microbiome. One study I looked at actually described emulsifiers as having an antibiotic effect. So if we think of antibiotics, they not only kill the bad bacteria, but they also can kill the good bacteria living in our gut, which, as we'll learn in a minute, can really wreak havoc and cause a lot of more chronic conditions over time. The second thing is added sugars and artificial sweeteners. So I think a lot of people know that added sugars aren't the best for our bodies, but artificial sweeteners are oftentimes used to reduce the number of calories that we intake. It's kind of like a healthier option. But we actually have seen in studies that sucralose in particular has been studied quite extensively, that can actually decrease the number of good bacteria and again, increase the number of potentially pathogenic bacteria living in our gut, causing that imbalance. And then excessive caffeine. So for you coffee drinkers, it's not all bad news. Some caffeine, especially in the form of coffee, for certain people can be beneficial. It does have some antioxidant properties, but excessive caffeine can not only cause problems for people who struggle with like acid reflux, or of course, like the quality of coffee also makes a difference, but it also can be quite acidic, especially on an empty stomach, causing some issues with kind of the intestinal tract and kind of just overall breaking down that barrier. And then excessive alcohol, not only is that a toxin, but it also can mess with our estrobolome, which is a really fun word that we'll learn about when we talk about hormones in the gut. But excessive alcohol, most of us know, is not necessarily going to promote health long-term, regardless. And then exposures such as glyphosate. So glyphosate is the most widely used herbicide in agriculture. So a lot of our wheat and our corn are sprayed with things like Roundup. And you may have seen in the last couple of years, a lot more news reports coming out with the carcinogenic or potentially carcinogenic effects of glyphosate. And it can have a potentially carcinogenic effect on our cells. Something else I really found interesting is that also can affect certain enzymes that can cause bacteria to break down, particularly those cell walls of the bacteria, which isn't a good thing when we're thinking about good bacteria, right? And it also things like Clostridium or Salmonella, which are potentially bad bacteria that can cause infection. Those have been shown to be resistant to glyphosate. So those can actually proliferate in that environment where we're having a lot of those foods with that particular herbicide and the residues of glyphosate on our foods. So we're most likely going to see this in industrial or a lot of corn products or a lot of wheat products. And that's why a lot of people might tolerate gluten-containing grains, particularly wheat, in European countries, but not in the United States, because of the rigorous standards that that they follow in those European countries. They actually have a lot more red tape in what they allow in their agriculture. And then antibiotics, so that's kind of a more obvious one that we talked about before, but again, that can also kill your good bacteria. And then the third bullet point here is medications. So things like oral contraceptives have been linked with leaky gut. They also can affect absorption of a lot of our important nutrients. NSAIDs can reduce prostaglandins and erode the mucosal lining. And then things like Tylenol can damage the lining of the stomach and depletes glutathione, which is our body's one of the most important antioxidants in our body. And then the last one there is PPIs, which are things like Protonics, Pepcid, and those can interfere with B12 and also promote small intestine bacterial overgrowth.
So we had a couple of questions come in.
Sure, yeah.
One of them was, does that include stevia?
So when I was doing my research on this, I was kind of looking around, and stevia has not been around long enough to really know how it impacts our guts. I think there is some research out there that any non-nutritive sweetener can kind of mess with our cravings for sweet foods, but I don't know if that kind of falls into the same bacterial dysbiosis category as things like sucralose or some of those other ones.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Andrew asked, what is leaky gut?
Yeah, so that's a really great question, and thank you for asking about that again. So this is what we refer to as leaky gut or intestinal permeability. So leaky gut happens when the breakdown of those proteins, specifically things like zonulin, occludin, here in these where it says tight junctions. I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, but that is referred to as leaky gut when those undigested food particles, toxins, and other things like antigens elicit that immune response by getting through that single layer of cells through our digestive tract. Did I answer that question?
Andrew, let us know. He says yes.
Okay.
And then there's another question about gut health influencing lipid levels and gut health versus weight gain. I don't know if you're going to address those later, but just wanted to bring that up.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm glad that you guys are interested in that, because those are my next couple of slides. And so was there any other questions before I move on, Daniel?
Nope, that's it so far.
Okay, cool. So really why I'm passionate about this and why I want to make sure that we talk about, not only all of the reasons or all the things that affect our gut, but also how to mitigate those risks, are because at least 70% of Americans have some type of GI symptom or disease. And I would argue to say it's probably higher than that, because not everything is just gastrointestinal symptoms. And 90% of females actually experience some sort of gastrointestinal issue over the course of their life. So when we look at impaired gut health, whether we call it leaky gut or intestinal permeability, this can show up in a variety of different ways. And so here we see cardiovascular health being impacted, cancers, brain health, development or progression of autoimmune conditions, diabetes, insulin resistance, food allergies, IBS, IBD, liver conditions, overweight and obesity, skin, sleep, and women's health. And so the severity of intestinal permeability also might be increased by the presence of dysbiosis, which again refers to the imbalance of good and bad bacteria, inflammation, and glucose metabolism disorders. So it's kind of like the chicken or the egg. Like if you already have other metabolic dysfunction, it can impact your gut. And if your gut is not, in a healthy state, it can impact a lot of other organ systems. So the gut-brain connection is something that is becoming a little bit more popularized in the media, and there's a lot of research on something called psychobiotics, which is hopefully really promising in how optimizing gut health can promote better mental health. And so about 3/4 of our neurotransmitters are produced in the digestive tract. So this is things like serotonin, melatonin, GABA. And this makes sense because our gut and our brain are constantly communicating back and forth with one another. So for a lot of people, when they're having digestive symptoms, it can actually affect their mood, things like anxiety, depression. And actually, when we're having a chronically triggered stress response, we actually have higher perceived levels of abdominal pain. So it's not just in your head, but there's actually this crosstalk between your digestive tract and your overall brain. And that's happening through what's called the vagus nerve. So if you've ever been told to mindfully eat or to take some deep breaths when you're feeling anxious, or if you've ever experienced like having to run to the bathroom when you're anxious or nervous, or you have like butterflies, this is why. And this vagus nerve here, this is a very simplistic diagram, but this is showing how a lot of those neurotransmitters are actually going to communicate through that vagus nerve, which is kind of what innervates our entire digestive tract all the way up to our brain. So I don't know if anybody has any questions about that. I know it's kind of a confusing concept when we think about it, but basically kind of how you talk about yourself, how you, kind of eat. So if you're eating really quickly, or you're eating under a source of stress, or you're eating while you're working or looking at the computer, subconsciously, your brain is still kind of having a stress response that can affect that communication with your gut. So you're not going to know when you're full as quickly. You're going to kind of dysregulate some of those hunger and satiety signals, hormones like ghrelin or leptin. And so this can definitely affect our weight as well, because we're more likely to overeat or eat things that we wouldn't normally have in times of stress.
Awesome. Carrie asked a question whether damage to the vagus nerve can negatively impact gut health.
Absolutely, absolutely. So when we're thinking about the vagus nerve, this a lot of things like traumatic brain injuries or concussions, or even being on medications that inhibit some of those neurotransmitters, especially GABA or acetylcholine. This can affect our gut health because we can't have that appropriate crosstalk between the two. So there's different like vagus nerve training exercises out there. There's things like heart math, there's things like actual vagus nerve stimulation. And so there's exercises that you can do at home. And then there's also a little bit more extensive exercises that you do through a medical professional. But some of those examples of medications that can also interfere are things like Benadryl or Xanax, for example. And then infections can also cause issues. So if you've had any sort of infection that can affect brain inflammation, this potentially can also cause issues with the gut. And interestingly, COVID actually, because of the immune system impact that COVID has, it can also really affect, it obviously affects our immune system, but it also innervates and causes issues with gut function. So that's why a lot of people were having digestive symptoms because of that.
Awesome, thank you. Another one came in asking about the effect of psychological trauma / PTSD on the vagus nerve and whether that impacts the gut health as well.
Yeah, it does. And so for a lot of the same reason that we're kind of talking about, a lot of those neurotransmitters can be blunted, for lack of a better word. And so, you know, I don't know the actual physiology of all of it, like every single mental health disorder and how they might differ in terms of the impact on the vagus nerve, but it all is interrelated, absolutely.
And Nadia also asked whether it's possible to heal that.
It is, yeah. So some of those like vagal nerve stimulation mechanisms I talked about, but I think also like this is why mindfulness and meditation is so powerful, because that mindfulness and meditation not only kind of teaches you to tap into that deep belly breathing, but it also helps to strengthen that connection. Because if you think about like your diaphragm and where you're breathing from, so kind of doing those really deep belly breaths, it actually helps to stimulate your vagus nerve throughout your digestive tract and strengthen that connection between the brain and the gut.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure. So some of these I'm going to go through fairly quickly. So you guys are going to get these slides, and there's a lot of resources and a lot of notes in the slides that you can look into if you're interested in specifics. But gut health and cancer has a couple of kind of associations here, and you'll find that throughout the different conditions I'm talking about, a lot of it really comes down to inflammation and immune health. Because if you remember, 70% of our immune system is located within our gut. And so the kind of the big way that we kind of associate cancer and immune health is a couple of reasons. One is the inhibition of bacteria to actually convert certain substances or certain signaling into carcinogens. We actually also see a lower intestinal pH, which can reduce the microbial activity. And then we have altered motility throughout the gut and transit time. So if we have a lot of toxic substances, one primary way that our body detoxifies is by having normal bowel movements. So if we're not appropriately detoxifying and we're not having regular bowel movements every day, at least once, then we're going to kind of have some of those toxic substances potentially sitting in our digestive tract, leading to things like colon cancer and other immune responses from there. Overweight and obesity, this is a pretty hot topic when we talk about gut health. And it's more than just calories in and calories out. And so there's something called the firmicutes and Bacteroides ratio. And so this kind of refers to the overarching like species of bacteria. And so the firmicutes tend to be more inflammatory, whereas the Bacteroides tend to be less inflammatory. And so the more the ratio is kind of tilted towards firmicutes, we tend to have higher levels of higher body weight, more issues with insulin resistance, diabetes, and other problems with glucose response or glucose utilization. And so really kind of promoting the health of our gut can really help to also allow our bodies to utilize glucose a little bit more efficiently, but also we can actually extract more or less calories based on the type of bacteria that are populated, which I thought was really interesting. And like I mentioned earlier, the hunger and satiety hormones, leptin and ghrelin, are also affected by the types of bacteria in our gut. The gut-liver connection. So this is another one that's kind of related to my last slide on overweight and obesity, but gut bacteria play a really key role in the maintenance of the gut-liver axis. And so ethanol, a lot of other toxins, ammonia, acetaldehyde are all produced and metabolized by the liver. And we also, like I mentioned before, we have like these different types of bacteria that some harvest more energy than others. And so if we're having a lot of like a really high fat diet, or we're not utilizing a lot of the energy that we're intaking, it can potentially result in adiposity and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And then we also see some of that, again, related back to inflammation. When we have a leaky gut or that intestinal permeability that causes that immune response, that also can cause a lot of what's called bacterial endotoxins or lipopolysaccharides, which are kind of like outer parts of our cells that really can cause something called endotoxemia or a really toxic response to our system. And then there's a couple of other things there that we can get into at the end if anyone's interested, but I'm going to skip ahead for the meantime. One other person, I know someone submitted a question about what if you don't have a gallbladder, and I'm bringing that up here because the liver produces bile and the gallbladder stores it. But if someone has their gallbladder removed, we're kind of having this like constant drip of bile into the intestines, which can again throw off the balance of our good bacteria because it influences the pH of the intestines. So supplementing with things like different digestive enzymes can be helpful, but also focusing on those mindful eating practices that help to stimulate natural enzymes throughout the gut. And then blood glucose control and diabetes, I kind of touched on this already, but really the main associations here, again, come back to increased intestinal permeability, low-grade endotoxemia, and then the changes in the production of the food that we use for our good bacteria. And so here's a couple of other mechanisms. So if you're interested, you can kind of look, this is from one particular research study that really goes into glycemic control. And they're relating it to number one, secretion or inhibition of something called GLP-1, which if you're familiar with things like, there's different drugs out there that can actually either block secretion of this or enhance it. And this is how a lot of weight loss drugs are working now. There's also short chain fatty acid production, which we'll talk about in just a minute and kind of how to boost that up. But I think you'll see in a minute that pre and probiotics really help to mitigate all of these risk factors. So I want to make sure we get to that. And then cardiovascular disease is a really interesting one and something that not a lot of people really think about when it comes to the gut. And so I want to talk about one particular mechanism called TMA. And so on this slide, gut bacteria convert choline, carnitine, and ergothioneine into TMA, and the TMAO is actually converted in the liver. And so when we see this, especially in some of like our health reports that we do at Wild Health, we see elevated levels of TMAO associated with inflammation, accumulation of cholesterol in the blood vessels, endothelial dysfunction, and possible blood-brain barrier disruption as well. But pre and probiotics, as well as a lot of our cruciferous vegetables, so this is things like broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, kale, these are all associated with lower TMAO production. And the reason is because there's at least 8 distinct bacterial strains that actually participate in the formation of TMA and preventing the conversion to TMAO. And TMAO is present in cold water fish. So some people get kind of afraid to incorporate too much of that into their diet if their TMAO is high. But one way, so I think that having a good balance, number one, is important. But one way that we can kind of mitigate those risk factors, again, is making sure that we have plenty of fibers, plenty of mostly plant foods in our diet, really promoting the lowering of that TMAO. So this is a really busy slide. I'm not going to go through it, but the reason why I left it in is because this just highlights all of the ways that our whole entire body is influenced by our gut function. And so all of these green lines are the interactions that actually protect against signs of metabolic syndrome. So you see here that the short chain fatty acids, which are things like acetate, propionate, and butyrate, all impact both the intestinal utilization of gluconeogenesis and also our brain functioning. But there's a lot of other green lines on there too, like flavonoid-rich foods, and really making sure that we're getting lots of those fibers. And then interactions that prevent or promote metabolic syndrome, you see there's a lot of orange lines on there too. Too much energy, so over like a really high caloric diet, any sources that, or anything that's contributing to excess inflammation, essentially. Skin health is also related to our gut, so things like eczema, psoriasis, even things like hives or rashes. So people who have a lot of allergies, we also look at the gut for that, particularly if they also have seasonal allergies, a lot of food allergies, or react to things like wine or fermented foods. We think about the histamine response, which is also mitigated by proper gut health and reducing the overall histamine load through the enzyme that actually breaks down histamine is located within our gut wall. So when there is any type of infection or imbalance, that's where we see higher levels of histamine responses. And then lastly, for the set of conditions, I just want to talk a little bit about women's health concerns. I know this is also a really hot topic right now. And so it comes down again to 3 things: inflammation, the immune system response, and that really fun word I talked about earlier, the estrobolome. And so what is the estrobolome? I want to talk about that first. That's a collection of bacteria in the gut that's actually capable of metabolizing and modulating circulating estrogen. Okay, so when we think about the estrobolome, we think about like recycling of estrogen and estrogen homeostasis, so keeping it within healthy ranges. It's like I said earlier, it's estimated that as many as 90% of females experience GI issues, and our hormones are part of the reason to blame on that. But they also play a role in peristalsis, which is kind of like the movement of food throughout our digestive tract. So that's why a lot of times right around like ovulation or right before our period, we might have more digestive symptoms, particularly like looser stools, cramping, sometimes constipation, depending on which way it goes. And then antibiotics and hormonal contraceptives have been found to alter both the gut microbiota, as we talked about earlier, but also estrogen levels within the body. And so when we think about the estrobolome, the bacteria that is capable of kind of metabolizing this estrogen produces an enzyme called beta-glucuronidase. And so this is something that we can actually test for and is on a lot of our gut health tests, particularly if you've ever done like a Genova diagnostic stool profile, it will show you your levels of beta-glucuronidase. So estrogen dominance, this is a reason why a lot of people have things like really painful periods, PMS syndrome, and this can be caused if there's an excess of certain bacteria that produce beta-glucuronidase. And then it's reverted the excess estrogen into the blood, kind of into unconjugated active form, and kind of absorbed back into the bloodstream, resulting in those estrogen dominant symptoms. And then we also see a benefit to incorporating lots of fiber-rich foods or a plant-rich diet in menopause. We find that incorporating lots of those prebiotic fibers from plant foods actually reduce symptoms that are related to some of those the increase in bacteria that basically utilize estrone, which is the less desirable form of estrogen, as you see here. We also see other estrogen-related diseases such as endometriosis, PCOS, and certain cancers. When we were talking about cancers earlier, breast cancer and prostate cancer are also really important in this conversation. And so how do we optimize gut health? So now we talked about all of the reasons why your gut health might be impaired. We talked about diseases associated with impaired gut health. But I want to talk about the positives now, because I think that this is hopefully the biggest takeaway from today's presentation. And the way that I think about optimizing gut health is through a model called weed, seed, and feed. So we basically want to remove anything that's contributing to inflammation or imbalances. Seeds mean increase all of the inputs that really have a positive impact on the gut, whether it's introducing digestive enzymes to help along the digestive process, it's introducing gut healthy fibers, and then making sure that we're continuing to feed gut health through long-term lifestyle interventions. So why is this important? 20% of the population actually alters their diet due to perceived adverse food reactions. And so this is really important to work with someone who kind of understands gut health and understands the trajectory, because a lot of people will do a test and they'll think that they have to avoid all of those foods for a long period of time. And not only can that really lead to kind of disordered eating patterns, but it can also affect and cause different nutrient deficiencies in the long run if it's not done appropriately. So we look at doing, if somebody is having a lot of digestive symptoms, or they are having anything from like migraines, skin issues, joint pain, brain fog, different, those can all kind of warrant an elimination diet. And there's all different types of elimination diets out there, but you don't necessarily have to be having outward gut symptoms to be having a gut issue, basically. So an elimination diet helps to determine kind of the culprit of what's contributing to the symptoms. And it usually entails kind of a period of elimination, usually about 4 to 6 weeks. Sometimes it might be longer depending on the person and the severity of their symptoms. And then the goal would be to reintroduce a lot of those foods back in really systematically to see how the person feels when reintroducing them. There are certain foods that may need to be out more long-term, especially for people who have autoimmune conditions. When we think about intestinal permeability or leaky gut, gluten and dairy are probably the top 2 foods that are associated with that, especially in autoimmune conditions. So that's where kind of a professional can help kind of work that out and really figure out what warrants that you remove or add back in a food after the trial period. And then we also want to make sure that we're talking about mindful eating practices, chewing food well, and if they're removing those foods, especially gluten, from their diet, what are they replacing it with? Is it a lot of highly processed gluten-free products that then have a lot of those emulsifiers and gums and other potentially problematic ingredients that we talked about earlier? Now, if they go through an elimination diet and they're still having symptoms, then it might warrant further testing. I'm not a huge fan of going straight to testing, even though it might seem like the easy way out, because elimination diets are hard. I'm not going to lie. It's not fun to cut foods out of your diet. But the testing can be a lot more accurate and a lot more effective after you've done some of the groundwork to kind of heal your gut and reduce some of the inflammation first. So there's a lot of testing that can be done, including food sensitivity testing, looking at IgG and IgA responses, but we also can do things like microbiome tests, intestinal permeability tests, which I'll show you in just a minute, breath tests, a celiac disease panel, other markers that might show up on a complete metabolic panel or a CBC with differential, immunoglobulin levels, and then something like an endoscopy, colonoscopy, motility tests, things like that. So here's a couple of examples of microbiome testing. And so I'm a fan of testing and not guessing in a lot of the cases, especially with suspected SIBO, which is small intestine bacterial overgrowth. A lot of people will just go towards supplements or asking for antibiotics to help with their symptoms. But if you are unnecessarily treating an infection with, even if it's an herbal antimicrobial, those still have the tendency to kill off good bacteria and potentially be harmful if it's not done correctly. So with testing, we can see inflammation markers. Calprotectin can be indicative of inflammatory bowel disease, for example. We can look at insufficiencies of enzymes. We can look at other imbalances and really make sure that we're adding in foods that are supportive of what the patient or the client needs. So here on the left, this is an example of the Thorne microbiome test. And it can really show you, do you have lots of good bacteria? But not only do you have a lot of the good bacteria, but also making sure that you have a diverse amount of bacteria. So it's not about just having one good strain and having a lot of it. It's about really having a lot of diversity in your gut microbiome, which is done by having a diverse diet. And then this is just an example of how you might test for some of those tight junctions like zonulin or lipopolysaccharides, which are some of those toxic materials. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about those foods and how we re-inoculate and support gut health in the long term. So if someone's having a lot of symptoms, these things might not be able to be included right away. And that's where kind of gradual reintroduction after either testing or doing some of the groundwork to figure out what the culprit of the symptoms are. But prebiotics, these are basically fibers, especially things like our cruciferous vegetables, things like flax seeds, chia seeds, some whole grains. And the fermentation of these prebiotic fibers produce those short chain fatty acids in the gut, which again is like food for that good bacteria and really helps them to proliferate and grow. And it also can help to maintain the integrity of the gut lining to prevent those breaches in the barrier, and also to fight against the growth of harmful bacteria. And then probiotics, most of you all know as probiotics as a supplement that you take in a capsule form, but the most beneficial probiotics are going to be from the foods that we eat, fermented foods and foods with live and active cultures. So things like sauerkraut, kimchi, certain types of yogurts and other cultured products, because they also have a lot of other vitamins and minerals, and they have other benefits over and above just the active cultures. And then polyphenols found in things like berries, vegetables, nuts, seeds, beans, dark chocolate, coffee, yay, tea, and olive oil. These also have a synergistic relationship with those prebiotics and probiotics to really support a really nice, diverse ecosystem, and also to add antioxidants and to reduce inflammation in the gut overall. So here on the left, I have a picture of a really lush and diverse rainforest, and this is really what we're going for when we're thinking about good gut health. Again, we want to have a variety of different strains, and we want to make sure that we're really promoting that by having a really wide and diverse amount of plant foods in our diet. On the right, this is what our gut might look like after a course of antibiotics. It's really barren. It's kind of a picture of deforestation. And so we really want to make sure that we're repopulating that with those good bacteria. And I guess my case for probiotics would be after a course of antibiotics, or if someone is going through a major period of stress, whether it's running an Ironman or doing a lot of high intensity training or doing a lot of international travel, anything that causes a threat to the immune system can also pose a threat to our gut health. And that potentially could warrant a little bit of extra probiotics in the form of a supplement. So what are the most common probiotics? The lactobacillus and the bifidobacterium are probably the most common. And these are what you're going to find in most probiotics. However, you don't necessarily want to just megadose with probiotics if you already have a pretty healthy diet, because it is possible to get too much of a good thing. So rotating them, getting different strains, and making sure that you're also really prioritizing getting pro and prebiotics from food sources is always ideal. But I know a lot of people don't love fermented foods. So keep trying them, and there might be types that you like that you don't even realize. Also, a lot of people, I actually got a question about if you should take pre and probiotics all the time. And again, my answer is no. Some probiotics will give you more than you need. And so if you're going through, like I said, time of stress or after antibiotics, it can be effective. And then somebody had also asked about when you have an infection, do you want to take antibiotics? And my answer to that would be if we want to make sure it's actually a bacterial infection, not a viral infection, because an antibiotic is not going to do anything against viruses. And there's a lot of antimicrobial foods. So things like garlic, cinnamon, lots of herbs and spices have antimicrobial properties. So by having a lot of those and then really protecting the integrity of our gut through getting enough protein and from things like bone broth, which has a lot of really helpful amino acids, particularly glutamine, can be really healing when you're sick or when you think you have an infection. But always go off your doctor's recommendations. Obviously, they know best. And then just a few other things I want to make sure that we touch on. One is the misconception about something called phytoestrogens. So isoflavones and lignans are found in vegetables, legumes, and particularly in flax seeds. But a lot of people are really afraid to incorporate things like really high quality soy or things like flax seeds because they heard that they have estrogen. But phytoestrogen, particularly in those plant foods, can actually have protective activity for things like breast cancer, prostate cancer, cardiovascular disease, even things like osteoporosis and menopause. And so it's important to understand that if you have really low levels of estrogen, these phytoestrogens can actually bind to those estrogen receptors and increase in a healthy, positive way. And if there's too much estrogen, these fibers help to recycle and kind of excrete any excess estrogen through the digestive process. So I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that as well.
Hey, Ariana, we had a question come in about if somebody's already taken the fancy stool and blood tests and they did everything that was recommended and they still haven't seen a change, what would be the next step to support their gut biome?
Yeah, so they already did a stool test and they already did like an elimination diet, it sounds like. So some of the other things from there might be doing a little bit more immune testing, potentially. So just because of the impacts of a variety of different organ systems on the gut, there could be things that a stool test just hasn't shown. And it might be worth doing something like exploring a little bit more into hormone levels, exploring into individual food sensitivities. So elimination diets will cover a lot of it, but sometimes we have cross reactivity between foods. So for example, if someone has cut out gluten and dairy, but they're still having a lot of symptoms, it's possible that their body is also cross reacting to other grains. Or even other foods in general. And so that's where potentially a food sensitivity test could come into play. But we also could be having other exposures in our environment, molds particularly, or other environmental exposures that are also causing an immune response that is not going to be shown on some of those other tests.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure. So I'm going to skip over a couple of these just for the sake of time. But I just wanted to go through, there's a lot of common gut health supplements out there, digestive enzymes, bitters, Bitters, which we can get from dark green leafy vegetables, they just help to promote natural enzyme release throughout the digestive tract. There's a few that we kind of talked about in terms of gut barrier function. One was glutamine, which we also get from a lot of our foods that are rich in collagen. So things like bone broth. Don't necessarily have to take a collagen supplement, although you can. Things like gelatin, smaller fish, particularly things like sardines, controlling inflammation through things like turmeric, omega-3s, and other herbs and spices. Metabolic function, so berberine is one of those that has similar effects on our glucose metabolism as something like metformin, supporting the gut-brain connection through things like 5-HTP or tryptophan, which are precursors to a lot of our other neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, things like that. Magnesium. And then it wouldn't be a talk about wild health without talking about some of the SNPs that may be associated with gut health issues. And so two of them of particular interest are the last two. So on our genetic reports that we run, we look at ADI-POQ, which puts individuals at higher risk for colon cancer. And that's where we might recommend increasing vitamin A rich foods. And then SLC23A1 is correlated with a vitamin C transporter, which can put individuals at a risk for inflammatory bowel diseases. And that's where we recommend really making sure that they're getting enough vitamin C through their diet, potentially through supplementation as well. And then a couple of things to kind of end today. Some of the newer features in research is around gut health and athletic performance. And some of this is what I did my graduate thesis on. And we find that athletic or active individuals in general have different microbiome diversity than people who are not active or who are sedentary. There's a couple particular bacteria of interest. One is Akkermansia, which is also associated with better metabolic function and lower body weight. And Villanella, which is helpful for actually degrading lactate, which is known for promoting some of the soreness in the muscles that you feel during higher intensity workouts. And then some of these might also help with nitric oxide production. So having higher levels of certain beneficial bacteria can also correlate with a higher VO2 max. And then they also have higher levels of short chain fatty acids and improved transit time, which is hit or miss if it's beneficial or not. For a lot of people, obviously constipation is not good and having healthy bowel movements is important, but having too quick of transit time or having looser stools can be a problem for people who are running like marathons or doing higher intensity exercise and feel like they have to run to the bathroom. And so one reason that happens is because extreme exercise. So I'm thinking like marathon runners or individuals who are doing like Ironman races or things like that. They have an increase in inflammation, but also if they're not recovering well, or they're using a lot of those gels and a lot of those simple carbohydrate sports supplements, it can be kind of the perfect storm to causing that intestinal imbalance, but also having a lot of that leaky gut scenario happening, which over time can really wreak havoc on our immune system. So that's where we see a lot of athletes have higher incidence of respiratory conditions and a lot of other associated issues, even things like joint pain and things like that. So cool. And then that's also like if you're exercising in the heat or different altitudes, that's going to kind of have a compounding impact on why that happens. So I kind of want to leave it at that because that's kind of the new and exciting research. I know a lot of individuals who work with Wild Health and follow up Wild Health are kind of in that athletic world. So with that, I know it's already 7:02 and I've talked a lot, but is there any other questions that came through?
Yes, there was one about receiving a comprehensive list of the emulsifiers and gums to avoid.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. What would be the best way for me? Would that be for me to send it to you, Daniel?
Yeah, so if you have that, we can include that in the follow-up email.
Absolutely.
Okay, another one is about spirulina, hearing more about it as a protein source, bees, etc. Is it any better or worse than other supplements we know of?
So spirulina has a lot of really, it's kind of considered a superfood, right? So not only is it a vegetarian vegan source of protein, it's a source of some B vitamins, and it also can, I think some of the research is showing that it can help lower cholesterol levels, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not an expert on spirulina, but I think that there are some metabolic effects and ways that it's helpful for like cholesterol regulation, things like that as well. So that's all I can tell you, but I think that there's little harm in trying it. I know that there's all different types out there, and so finding one that is from a reputable source, just like any other supplements, is important.
Awesome, thank you. We have three more. One is questioning whether bitters means the type found in mixed drinks.
So not really. So when I'm talking about bitters, I'm talking more about things like your really dark greens, but there are some bitters that are sold as supplements, and some of them might be the same ones that are used. I'm not an expert on bitters in like mixed drinks. I'm sorry. But what happens with bitters is that it actually activates certain receptors throughout the digestive tract to secrete enzymes and help with digestion. So if anyone knows the answer to that, feel free to chime in with the bitters that you use in mixed drinks, but I'm not sure.
Awesome, thank you. Another one is on thoughts on homemade kombucha. Good probiotic. Does sugar outweigh benefits? And is drinking 16 ounces every day too much?
To answer the last question, 16 ounces per day is probably too much, just because, again, like you're not sure exactly how much of the bacteria you're getting. The reason I'm not in love with kombucha is because I think that it can, for individuals who have issues with like candida or yeast, it has been shown to have negative effects on that. It can actually cause the yeast to proliferate. I also think that you get into trouble with the sugar content. So if you're making it at home, you're more likely to be controlling for that. But I think in moderation, it's totally fine. It's a good source of probiotics if you're making it at home. The store-bought ones, I'm not super sold on. So I think in moderation, yes, with other probiotic foods incorporated could be healthy.
Awesome. One more. Jennifer Sabo asked recommendations to increase fiber and remain in ketosis.
Yeah, so there's plenty of fibers that can be included. So some of my favorite ways to get fibers on a ketogenic diet or to maintain ketosis, whether you're on a fully ketogenic diet or not, would be primarily your dark green leafy vegetables and things like broccoli and cauliflower and Brussels sprouts, because the carbohydrates, the dietary fiber kind of cancels out the carbohydrates in those foods because dietary fiber is not going to be absorbed. But also things like chia seeds or flax seeds are going to be really great ways to get prebiotics. We also get prebiotics from things like anything in that allium family. So if you're like a garlic or onion or leeks, and I know those have a little bit more carbs than something like kale or spinach or other dark green leafy vegetables, but if you're kind of being really intentional and strategic about it, you can certainly incorporate a lot of those in there.
Awesome. Another one came in. Anything that you as a specialist recommend as gut health superfoods people should try to consume more of? Maybe we can include that in the follow-up email as well.
Yeah. I mean, my favorite ones, so I think it's beneficial, like I said, to have a couple of different types of fermented foods every day. And so the most practical way that I found to do this is just to buy a couple of different ones that you like and rotate them throughout the week. It doesn't take a lot. So what I do is I will incorporate a couple of tablespoons of either sauerkraut or kimchi into my eggs or onto a salad, which also promotes gut health. Eggs are rich in choline, which also provides a lot of your B vitamins and omega-3s. They're also a really great source of protein. And then dark green leafy vegetables as well. I've already talked about them a lot, but those are other like superfoods that are also going to act as prebiotics. but they also have a lot of those nutrients that serve as kind of fuel for increasing the other benefits of those prebiotics, kind of that symbiotic relationship between the two. So kimchi, sauerkraut. I also am a big fan of doing the like cultured cottage cheese from time to time. I know for a lot of people dairy is like but I really like the good culture because it's also a good source of protein. And I know a lot of people, especially in kind of the athletic world, have a hard time getting protein as it is. So you get a lot of benefits from that as well.
Awesome. Last one to close us out is, what about colon irrigation? Is it recommended?
Is this referring to something like an enema? I'm not sure what irrigation.
Not sure. Yes.
Okay. I haven't looked into this enough to really be able to provide a great answer. So our body's pretty smart, and our body tends to kind of regulate itself in a way that it knows how. So in terms of like enemas and things like that, I think for certain people dealing with some major intestinal issues, maybe parasitic infection or something like that, could potentially benefit from it. However, your body is really good at detoxifying on its own and kind of flushing out and balancing out some of those things that in my opinion, I don't think that it's necessary for very many people, but I would love to look more into it and give you a little bit better of an answer.
Awesome. I think that's just about it.
Cool. Well, if anything comes in afterwards, let me know, and I'm happy to send out some of those extra resources with the slides.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and thank you, Ariana, for presenting and for sharing all of your information with us.
Absolutely. There's also, sorry, I missed one thing. There's some other texts and things if you guys want to learn more on the last slide. So when you guys get the slides and the replay, feel free to check those out as well.
Awesome. Thank you. And I mentioned this in the chat, but we will send out that follow-up email. It should be coming tomorrow. And it'll have the replay and your slides and that list of things we talked about. So thank you.
Thank you.